Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 23 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Buffalo Sabres and lost by a score of 4-2. And it was a tale of two games here for the San Jose Sharks because they actually started this game off rather well. The first 40 minutes of this one were quite successful. In fact, some of the best moments that we have seen from the San Jose Sharks throughout much of this season. On the other hand, the Buffalo Sabres were really struggling with some of the pace and pressure that the Sharks were bringing to this game. You know, as Sharks fans, but really as any NHL fans it applies to, because we're solely watching our team's game, or more or less only watching our team's games, we can have the tendency to fall into the trap of believing that the problems with the Sharks are entirely unique to them, that they are the only team in the league who has constant D-zone turnovers and constant unforced errors, when in reality this is an issue that faces many teams in the league. It is why that others can be around the same spot in the standings in the NHL where the Sharks currently find themselves. And it was on full display here with the Buffalo Sabres. They had those problems of giving pucks away in the D-zone. They were leaving the slot uncovered. They were having these D-zone breakdowns, and it was unfortunate, though, that the Sharks were only able to capitalize on it one time in that first period, because there were other great chances for themselves, but it was just Fabian Zetterlund who would actually get it past former Sharks goaltender James Reimer, and it would be quickly responded to by Peyton Krebs, and so it was a 1-1 game at the end of the first, which would be slightly disappointing for the Sharks, who probably thought they deserved a little bit better. But heading into the second, they did not put their heads down and mope about it, because they came out like a house on fire, getting some great chances for themselves. But again, a combination of that great goaltending as well as just a lack of killer instinct meant that they only managed a single goal in that second period, coming from Luke Kunin, and so they took a precarious 1-goal lead into the third period. Now, this was a relatively unique situation for the San Jose Sharks. More often than not, they've gone into third periods either tied or usually at a deficit. And this is where they have earned that identity of being comeback kids, of that never say die attitude, of always trying to keep these games close. While they don't always manage to complete the comeback, there are frequently able to tie these games, or at least bring it to within one, to keep people on their toes. But here tonight, this was a chance to see what can they do with actually playing with a lead. And after a strong first 40 minutes, you'd think they could close it out with a full game 60 minutes, but not the case, as not only do the Sharks lose this third period, but they lose it badly. They were outplayed by a significant margin by Buffalo at 5-on-5. Not only would the Sabres manage to tie this game up at 2, but they'd eventually get a shorthanded game winner, because while the Sharks struggled at 5-on-5, they got looks on the power play, including a 20-second brief 5-on-3 power play, but the only goal that gets scored there is that shorthanded game winner. So the Sharks definitely letting this one get away from them. They've had some disappointing losses this season, especially in getting blown out by the Jets and the Golden Knights, but this one is very much up there because it was an extremely winnable game here for San Jose that they truly just let drop right out of their fingers. Eventually, it is an empty netter from Rasmus Dahlin that tops this one off. It comes in the last second, so it's really kind of an irrelevant goal, but it exists anyway, and the Sharks lose it 4-2. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Lund line here for the San Jose Sharks, and I was interested to see what they would be able to do here tonight, especially with how poor the Sabres actually started this game off. You would think that not only the Sharks' best line on paper, but also the one that has the most chemistry would be able to come out and dominate shift after shift, and they did have some good ones, don't get me wrong. There were definitely multiple moments in which they looked quite good, but I was expecting more out of these three players. From an individual standpoint, we have Fabian Zetterlund, who I actually thought was the standout of this first line. Not only does he manage to get the goal, but it felt as though he was a lot more engaged than the other two players here, being physical, throwing his body around, really involved, picking off passes. I very much enjoyed what Zetterlund was doing, and it was a nice comeback performance for him because he was not very good in the other game against St. Louis. But it was both Granlund and Eklund who I could really only describe as a little bit off here tonight. Granlund, we're usually seeing a lot more poise in his game. A lot of the plays that he goes for are like 70 to 80% successful, and yet tonight it felt as though we were at less than a 50-50 point for him. It just felt as though a lot of those passes a little bit off for sure, and the same would have to go for William Eklund. Neither of these two players seemed completely locked in, and I do wonder if, and this is pure speculation, if there's perhaps some sort of injury issue hanging over both of them. For instance, when it comes to William Eklund, he was actually a game time decision here tonight, and while he does end up in the lineup, this is not the first time we've seen him be a game time decision this season. At that time, he also played the game, but then would miss the very next one. Could a similar situation happen here for Eklund? Is it possible that he was trying to play through an injury and that's why he didn't necessarily have the same type of success he has usually had this season? It's very possible. And the same goes for Mikael Granlund, because it's not just this game. While last game he did pick up a couple of primary assists, it did feel as though he was fighting the puck a little bit. I already mentioned in those 6-on-5 situations where Celebrini was winning face-off after face-off after face-off, it was Granlund who was mishandling the puck at the blue line, which allowed the Blues to actually get those decent chances on the empty net. And this can go back to just a couple of games ago, that high hit taken by himself on Ilya Lyubushkin for the Dallas Stars. He didn't miss, well, he missed a couple of minutes at the end of that game due to being pulled off for the concussion spotter, but he hasn't missed any actual time because he's played these next couple of games, and you have to wonder if there's perhaps some sort of underlying issue, or if indeed this is just a couple of off games. Hopefully that is indeed the case. You don't want to see either of these two players be out in any capacity, because they have been two of the Sharks' best players this season, but one is left to wonder with just how a little bit out of sorts they looked here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Celebrini and Goodrow being reunited with Will Smith. So after he had that development day off the other night against St. Louis, he takes his spot back on this second line. When it comes to Will Smith, there was a lot of good here tonight, I'll say that. Few really good passes, managed to find Celebrini for one. You would think Celebrini would have been able to finish that, but unfortunately a great save by James Reimer. We also saw him get himself into a couple of really good scoring positions. He probably could have had a goal here tonight with a bit more finish as well. He also managed to draw a penalty by driving to the net. That was good to see. So there was a lot of positives with Will Smith's game, but at the same time there were also a lot of negatives. We have talked in the past about things that Will Smith does need to do to improve. One of those major ones was definitely just his general pace at the NHL level. Keeping his feet moving was an issue that we have seen throughout this season and again here tonight, but that's actually not what I'm going to focus on. Instead, I actually want to focus on another thing, which is his general anticipation level at the NHL. It is a very different and speedier game than in college, and it is extremely difficult to be a reactionary player here in the NHL. If you're waiting for the play to develop in front of you to actually react to it, you're going to have a lot of problems. You're usually going to find yourself a step behind. You want to instead be, if to be an NHL player, a step ahead, to know what the play could be before it actually happens. And so, for instance, we take a look at a play near the end of the second period. Zach Benson comes into the offensive zone of this, or the defensive zone of the San Jose Sharks, attacking here for Buffalo. Will Smith is on the back check. He has his man pretty close to him, but instead of anticipating that this pass could come from Benson and getting his stick in the lane to either interrupt it by poking it off or even just prevent it from ever happening and making Benson make a different choice, instead he is playing in a reactionary sense that when this pass does come his way, he is too slow to get his stick on it, and it leads to a good chance for Buffalo. It doesn't lead to a goal, so no harm, no foul, but still it is an indicator that Will Smith, at least from a defensive standpoint, usually when he's playing with the puck, he does things quite well, but from a defensive standpoint, you need to have that kind of anticipation to be able to read the plays. Obviously, it is known that his defensive game wasn't very good, but still, that is kind of like a step one baseline that you need to be able to establish, and so that's something to watch Will Smith improve on, hopefully, as the season goes on. When it comes to his two line mates, we'll start off with Macklin Celebrini, who had a very kind of opposite game to the other night. Against St. Louis, his first couple of periods were pretty good. He was a part of the Sharks' best line, but nothing outstanding. But then he came out in the third period and was exceptional, and then that overtime, he looked really, really good as well. Here tonight, the first two periods, Celebrini had so many great chances. He probably should have had a goal. I even tweeted out that it was a crime that he didn't manage to get a goal. Not only did we see that great save on the Will Smith pass by James Reimer, but then we saw a potential save of the year candidate with a glove save and then reaching behind him to grab it out of the air that caused Celebrini to look up to the sky of like, what more can I do to actually get this goal here? And you could see that frustration building up. And then when it came to the third period, he honestly wasn't as good. He was still managing to make the few solid plays that he always does, but perhaps not that insane level of play that we have become accustomed to when it comes to Celebrini. And when we saw at the end Dahlin get this empty net goal, we also saw Celebrini break his stick on the post, and this is showing a frustration level to him. As we know, not only does he absolutely love winning, but he absolutely hates losing, and so there is definitely some frustration here on a Sharks team that even if he plays his absolute heart out, the team is going to lose more often than not because they just simply aren't very good. And it is about channeling that frustration in the right direction, if you can channel it in a positive way and you can use it to fuel you going into next game and play even better than you had in the past, that can be a very good thing. But what Celebrini does need to avoid, with the help of the coaching staff, is channeling that frustration in a negative way, where Celebrini begins to think that he has to do everything himself, or he begins to think that the habits that he has begun to establish here are not working out, and he tries to go back to maybe what was working for him in college, because this is probably the first time in his long career going through the junior leagues and college and everything like that where he has struggled as much as he has, not individually but as a team. And so you need to be able to keep him on the correct path, and I think he definitely has a good head on his shoulders and he's going to be able to do that, but it is something that you need to be able to keep an eye on. When it comes to the final player on this line, we do have Barclay Goodrow. I actually thought Goodrow started this game off pretty well, which was very, very surprising, and it wasn't so much of him riding off the coattails of Celebrini. He actually made a few really good offensive plays where, if I didn't know any better, I would think that the Sharks had picked up a body double with someone who actually had some offensive talent. But then, it got to the point as the game went on where I began to recognize Barclay Goodrow more and more, because he definitely fell off from an offensive perspective, but it was still an interesting start, so I'll give him credit for that. One thing that I do want to mention, however, I really am tired of seeing Barclay Goodrow on the power play, especially since the Sharks' power play has been struggling. I'm not putting it entirely on him, but he's certainly not helping the cause. There was actually an opportunity in the first period where he gets the puck near the crease. He has a good cross-crease pass to Will Smith, who has come down from the face-off circle. That would have been a potentially easy tap-in goal because the lane was available, but Goodrow doesn't recognize it. Instead, ends up going for a stuff play, which is a pretty easy save for Reimer. So it just goes to show it's one thing to have him play at 5-on-5 at even strength with Smith and Celebrini because yada yada yada, reasons, but on the power play when there's more space and it's pretty much just an offensive showcase, you want to actually have someone who can provide more value there. We've seen it potentially even from a Luke Cunnin, who had originally held the spot earlier on, but even someone like Carl Grundstrom, Dellandrea, Klim Kostin. I feel as though Goodrow is potentially the worst possible option on this team for this position, and yet he's consistently thrusted into it. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Wenberg and Toffoli being joined by Luke Cunnin. So we saw this substitution at the end of last game. It was a bit of a weird one. I wasn't completely understanding of why Cunnin ended up on the third line over Dellandrea, considering Dellandrea had been playing better, but it works out here tonight. I actually thought Luke Cunnin played a pretty good game. I wouldn't say he was the best player on his line. In fact, you could very well make the argument he was the worst player on his line, but that level of play was still quite high. He played with a ton of energy, throwing his body around. He managed to pick up a goal. He actually had a couple of other chances as well. So it was nice to see him get re-energized after, honestly, that middle part of this season thus far has been extremely slow for him. When it comes to the other winger, we had Tyler Toffoli, who was getting a ton of great chances. Kind of like what I said with Macklin Celebrini, it was almost a little bit of a crime that Toffoli didn't manage to get one goal. Usually he can be relied on when he gets those good chances from those good spaces. He's able to nail them, and yet he had like 3 or 4 exceptional looks, and yet either was getting saved by Reimer or just generally missing the net. And so he's probably not going to be particularly happy with himself, because he should have been able to have a goal here tonight and it just didn't end up working out. But generally, while we didn't get to see that same level of offensive talent that we did in the previous game when he was playing with Celebrini, which is the reason why I would have wanted to see him in that spot again with Celebrini and Smith, we did get to still have a pretty good game from Tyler Toffoli. Definitely one of the more effective forwards tonight for the Sharks. It's just unfortunately he didn't actually capitalize. And when it comes to the final player, we do have Alex Wenberg, who was a strong driving force behind this line. Not only was he able to find Toffoli with these great passes in the slot, but he was also quite solid from a defensive standpoint, get some good poke checks, really reading these plays very, very well. If Will Smith is going to be learning from somebody, there's a few good options like Granlund, but Wenberg is a very good one on top of that. He was managing to keep the puck on a string, essentially, with some of these stick handling moves he was pulling off. He was even somewhat physical at times, bullying a couple of people off pucks. So I thought this was a really solid game from Wenberg, definitely one of his better ones that we've seen him play with the Sharks. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we had Kostin come back down here, joining Grundstrom and Dellandrea now taking a spot on the fourth line. Giovanni Smith out of the lineup in favor of Will Smith. And this fourth line that had been previously not looking very good these last couple of games does bring back to the glory days of the fourth line. It looked quite solid. Klim Kostin, I thought, had a few really good plays through the neutral and in the offensive zone that helped set up some chances. Ty Dellandrea also didn't seem to get affected by this demotion to the fourth line. He still played with a ton of energy and was very, very effective for San Jose. And then Carl Grundstrom was a great tie-together piece, making some good plays. He did take that one penalty, but at least it was a trade-off 4-on-4. So not all bad, and I thought really the fourth line gave the Sharks a great game tonight, as they had been previously doing outside of those last couple of games. Then we move on to the defensive side of things, where you have Wallman and Ceci. You know, Wallman always walks a very, very thin line. You never really know what you're going to get from Jake Wallman, because he goes for these incredibly risky and aggressive plays, and if they work out, they look spectacular, and if they don't work out well, they look terrible. And here tonight, it was more on the spectacular side. Wallman was making some fantastic reads. He was jumping up aggressively in the play. He was interrupting defensive plays before they could even happen. I was very, very impressed with what Wallman was able to do. After his last couple of games were a bit of a struggle, it was nice to see him rebound considerably. When it comes to Cody Ceci, we still had the one inexplicable play as per usual. It's like a quota he constantly has to make. I think it was back in the first or perhaps the second period where he sort of passes the puck off the boards to nobody, and then it just goes straight to the Buffalo Sabres, and they end up getting a great chance on net. That was a little bit questionable, but besides that, I thought Ceci was rather solid, which has usually been the case even in those kind of boneheaded types of mistakes. So it is a positive game for the Sharks' top pairing. We then have the second pairing. We'll start with Timothy Liljegren. As it was a sort of up and down game for the Sharks, it was an incredibly up and down game for Liljegren, because there were some positives here. I actually thought from an offensive perspective, he actually jumped up quite effectively in the play multiple times and was a useful player on that end. Definitely one of his better games since he's come to the San Jose Sharks from an offensive perspective. But from a defensive perspective, he made a lot of major mistakes. We take a look at this first goal scored by the Buffalo Sabres. I won't fully blame him, because it seemed a little bit unlucky that this one kind of bounces off of his stick, but still, you need to be a bit more secure with the puck. He took a terrible penalty in the third period, which just was inexplicable. I don't know if it was frustration or what, but you just can't be doing that in the NHL. Just that made literally no sense that he ends up getting himself into that situation. And generally, I felt as though there were many defensive errors that he made. So there was good, there was bad. Probably averaged out more so on the bad side of things, a bit of a negative player for the Sharks tonight. His defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, interestingly enough, I actually thought Ferraro played all right. On this Cousins goal, Ferraro did get victimized. He ends up losing the puck here. It ends up being a giveaway, and that allows the Sabres to get the goal. So clearly wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There's still clearly some major problems with Mario Ferraro's game that really comes at no surprise to anybody. But I actually thought he was kind of held back a little bit by his defensive partner, Liljegren, who looked exceptionally bad here at times defensively tonight. And whilst I think Ferraro kind of had to pick up the slack at times, and he honestly did an okay job of that through much of this game. The third period wasn't the greatest, but those first couple of periods were quite good. And from an offensive perspective, where I said he had mostly blown the opportunities he got in that game against St. Louis, I actually thought he was a little bit more involved here and actually made a few slick offensive plays. So I wasn't hating Mario Ferraro's game tonight. And when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we'll start off with Jack Thompson, who actually got a second straight game here. So surprisingly, that Thrun ends up remaining on the sidelines in favor of Thompson. But I guess since Thompson did look quite good and was one of the Sharks' better defensemen against St. Louis, he ends up earning that slot. But unfortunately, it may have come to an end. While I actually thought Thompson played a pretty solid game throughout here tonight, that one mistake at the end with that penalty that I won't say cost the Sharks this game, but certainly did not help the cause whatsoever, is probably going to leave a sour taste in your mouth. It's not so much about what you have done, it's what you have done for me lately, and what has the sort of freshest memory in Warsofsky's mind about Thompson is that ill-advised late penalty. And so it may very well be the end of these couple of straight games for him, maybe back on the sidelines here and get Thrun back in. His defensive partner, Jan Ruda, as much as I've constantly talked about me hoping Jan Ruda would be the one to sit out some of these games at this point and having both Thompson and Thrun be your third defensive pairing, Ruda has actually done enough as of late to actually deserve continued spot in the lineup. Does it really make up for the first, 18 terrible games that he had this season? Not really. I would still vote for Thrun and Thompson as being the Sharks' third defensive pairing, but I can understand why Warsofsky has been hesitant to remove him as of late. over this last week. So an okay game for sure for Ruda. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, we do have Mackenzie Blackwood steps back in after having Askarov play a pretty good one in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues. Blackwood's come back in, and honestly, it wasn't the best of the best performances for Mackenzie Blackwood. The Krebs goal and the Tuck goal were both on, the Krebs one was in a 2-on-1. The Tuck one was a sort of pseudo breakaway. Both of these were savable shots, not ones that I'll blame heavily on Blackwood, but still. This second goal, however, from Dylan Cousins is one from far out. There's a bit of traffic, but not a ton of traffic in front. I think Blackwood should have been able to make that save. But the thing here is that you see on the other side of the ice, James Reimer is making some incredible saves and keeping the Buffalo Sabres alive while they're struggling for the first 30 or 40 minutes of this game, and then Blackwood just doesn't really come up with any big ones here tonight for the San Jose Sharks. So I can't say it's his fault, but didn't really help the cause, and he loses the goaltending battle. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday. They'll be taking on the Los Angeles Kings. The last time the Sharks actually played the Kings, they had a pretty good comeback in that one and managed to get a victory, and we shall see if they manage to repeat that same thing. Class dismissed.